The sound of wind moving through bare branches. A rustling of old paper. This is a journal entry. Written in shaking handwriting on yellowed paper, dated March 11, 1845. Found in a rotting barn outside Fort Wayne, Indiana, sealed inside a tin box beneath 18 inches of dirt and ash. The entry reads, "The trees are screaming. I can hear them at night. Root systems twisting, breaking through their own bark from the inside. Whatever I buried 30 years ago is waking up. I was a fool to think soil and seed could hold it forever. Funny thing, I planted half a continent, and now I can't save a single tree." It's signed simply, J. Chapman. Most people know him by another name. Johnny Appleseed. The Barefoot Wanderer. The patron saint of orchards. The man who walked the American frontier with a tin pot on his head and a sack of seeds on his back, spreading apple trees from Pennsylvania to Illinois like a benevolent ghost. But that's the story we tell children. This is the story we buried. The sound of footsteps on frozen ground. Creaking wood. A door scraping open. In the winter of 1845, John Chapman was 70 years old. His body was failing. His lungs rattled with every breath. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold a pen. And in a small orchard on the outskirts of a town that no longer exists, he was trying to save the last trees he'd ever planted. But the trees didn't want to be saved. Because they were never really trees at all. Let's start over. Let's go back to what we think we know. John Chapman was born in 1774 in Leominster, Massachusetts. His mother died when he was young. His father fought in the Revolutionary War. By the time John was in his 20s, he'd already begun moving west, carrying apple seeds collected from cider mills in Pennsylvania, planting nurseries along the frontier roads that carved through the wilderness. The legend says he was a gentle soul. A vegetarian. A man who wouldn't ride a horse because it was cruel to the animal. A mystic who slept under the stars and preached from the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish theologian who believed the physical and spiritual worlds were layered on top of each other like pages in a book. The legend says he wore a coffee sack as a shirt and walked barefoot through snow. That he befriended Native American tribes. That he saved settlers from starvation by teaching them to graft and grow. That his orchard stretched across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois like a map of generosity. And all of that is true. But it's not complete. Because what the legend doesn't mention is this: John Chapman planted his orchards in very specific locations. Always near water sources. Always in clearings surrounded by dense forest. Always in places where the soil was dark, almost black, and smelled faintly of sulfur. And he planted them in patterns. If you map every orchard Johnny Appleseed planted between 1800 and 1845, they form a geometric grid. Precise. Intentional. Ritualistic. Settlers didn't notice. Why would they? They were grateful for the fruit. But missionaries did. And land surveyors. And a few Shawnee elders who told stories about the places where Johnny planted his trees. Stories about cursed ground. About things that should not be disturbed. In 1838, a Presbyterian minister named Reverend William Claymore wrote a letter to his bishop describing an encounter with John Chapman near Mansfield, Ohio. The letter was archived in a church basement and forgotten until 1993. It reads, "I met the man they call Johnny Appleseed on the road to Perrysville. He was older than I expected. Thin as a scarecrow, eyes like he hadn't slept in years. I asked him why he planted apples in such strange places, so far from settlements. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, 'Because apples grow roots. And roots hold things down.' When I asked what he meant, he walked away. I did not follow. Roots hold things down. What did Johnny Appleseed bury beneath those trees? By 1845, Johnny was dying. He knew it. His body was collapsing, piece by piece. But he wasn't ready to go. Not yet. Because one of his orchards, the last one he'd planted, was failing. And if it failed completely, everything he'd spent his life containing would come loose. The orchard was located 3 miles outside a settlement called Archer's Point, Indiana. Population, 47. Mostly farmers, a general store, a church with no preacher. Johnny had planted the orchard in 1842. 23 trees in 3 concentric circles around a small clearing. Apple trees, but a strange variety. The fruit was bitter, almost inedible. The locals called them spit apples. No one ate them. No one went near the orchard, either. It was too quiet. Birds didn't nest there. Deer avoided it. Johnny visited the orchard every few months. Sometimes he'd camp there for a week, pacing between the trees, checking the bark, pressing his ear to the trunks like he was listening for a heartbeat. In February of 1845, he arrived and found the trees rotting. Not from disease. Not from insects. From the inside out. The bark was splitting open in long vertical cracks. The wood beneath was black, wet, pulsing faintly like infected tissue. The roots were breaking through the soil in twisted coils, clawing upward as if trying to escape the ground. And at night, the trees hummed. A low, vibrating sound that you felt in your teeth before you heard it. Like the earth itself was resonating. Johnny tried to laugh it off at first. Maybe the apples finally got tired of being wholesome. But his hands were shaking when he wrote that line in his journal. Because he knew what was happening. The seal was breaking. He spent the first week trying to reinforce the trees. He dug around the roots, packed fresh soil, carved symbols into the bark with a hunting knife. Old symbols. Protective marks he'd learned from a Lenape medicine man in 1804. It didn't work. On the 8th night, Johnny woke to the sound of wood splitting. One of the outer trees had cracked in half, toppling sideways into the clearing. The roots were exposed, and beneath them, the soil was moving. Something was pushing up from below. Johnny grabbed his lantern and ran to the edge of the orchard. He knelt down, held the light over the broken roots, and looked into the hole. The soil was black. Blacker than dirt should be. And it was breathing. Rising and falling. Slowly. Like the chest of something sleeping. Johnny whispered a prayer. Not to God. To the ground. He spoke in a language most Americans wouldn't recognize. A pidgin mix of Shawnee, Lenape, and something older. Something without a name. He was asking it to stay down. It didn't answer. But the humming grew louder. Johnny spent the next 2 weeks investigating. He traveled to the sites of his oldest orchards, the ones he'd planted 40 years earlier. He needed to know if the same thing was happening elsewhere. What he found was worse than he expected. In Richland County, Ohio, an orchard he'd planted in 1806 was completely dead. The trees were standing, but they were hollow. Burned out from the inside, as if something had crawled up through the roots and consumed them. The locals said the ground had started sinking 6 months earlier. Small depressions forming in concentric circles around the orchard. Like something below was pulling the earth inward. A farmer named Elias Stroud told Johnny that his daughter had gone missing near the orchard 3 weeks prior. She'd been playing at the edge of the tree line. When they found her the next morning, she was standing in the center of the clearing, barefoot, covered in black soil, speaking in a language no one recognized. She wouldn't eat. Wouldn't sleep. Just stood there, staring at the ground. The doctor said it was a fever dream. But Elias knew better. He'd heard stories about the orchard. About people who got too close and started hearing whispers in the roots. Johnny didn't stay long in Richland. But before he left, he walked into the dead orchard alone and stood in the center of the clearing for 20 minutes, not moving, not speaking. When he came out, his face was gray. He traveled south to Perrysville. Another orchard. This one planted in 1812. It was still alive, but barely. The trees were twisted, their branches growing downward instead of up, their leaves blackened at the edges. A local minister, Reverend Harlan, told Johnny that strange things had been happening. Livestock refusing to graze near the orchard. Dogs howling at night. And twice, settlers had reported seeing figures moving between the trees. Tall, thin figures that walked on too many legs. Harlan didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in evil. And he believed something evil was in that orchard. Johnny asked him if anyone had tried to cut the trees down. Harlan said yes. A logging crew had been hired in 1844. They made it through 2 trees before the foreman collapsed. Heart attack, the doctor said. But the crew said he'd been fine one moment, and the next he was on the ground, clutching his chest, eyes rolled back, muttering about something pulling him under. The crew quit. No one touched the orchard after that. Johnny spent 3 days in Perrysville, walking the tree lines, checking the root systems, taking soil samples. He filled a leather notebook with sketches and measurements. Diagrams that looked half scientific, half occult. On the 3rd night, he camped inside the orchard. That's when he found the first piece of direct evidence. Carved into the base of the oldest tree, almost invisible beneath 40 years of bark growth, was a symbol. A spiral inside a circle, intersected by 7 lines. It was the same symbol Johnny had been carving into his trees since 1801. But this one was carved from the inside out. Something below the roots had been trying to communicate. Johnny sat down with his back against the tree and stared at the symbol for an hour. Then he whispered, "I thought I could keep you buried." The tree hummed in response. By the time Johnny returned to Archer's Point, he knew the truth. All of his orchards were connected. Not just geographically. Spiritually. Symbiotically. The root systems had grown together underground, forming a vast network that stretched across 3 states. And at the center of that network, something was waking up. He opened his journal and began writing a letter. Not to a person. To whoever would find his body. The letter explained everything. In 1801, John Chapman had been traveling through western Pennsylvania when he met a Lenape elder named Falling Hawk. Falling Hawk told him a story about the ground beneath the frontier. About how the land was not empty. About how the settlers were building on top of something old. Something that had been sleeping for centuries. The elder called it the Root Father. A subterranean entity that existed in the spaces between soil and stone. It fed on decay, on death, on the quiet rot that happens underground where no one can see. For thousands of years, the tribes had kept it contained through ritual and respect. But the settlers didn't know. They were clearing forests, plowing fields, digging wells, disturbing the ground without understanding what they were waking. The Root Father was stirring. Falling Hawk told Johnny that the only way to keep it asleep was to create a new kind of containment. Not through violence. Through growth. By planting trees in sacred patterns. By creating root systems strong enough to hold the entity down. But the trees had to be planted in the right places. In the places where the Root Father's presence was strongest. In the places where the soil was black and smelled of sulfur. Johnny had spent his entire life planting those trees. And now, after 40 years, the trees were dying. Because the Root Father was tired of sleeping. Johnny returned to the orchard at Archer's Point on March 10, 1845. He was too weak to walk the full distance, so he rode on a borrowed mule, slumped forward, barely conscious. When he arrived, the orchard was worse. Half the trees had fallen. The others were bent at unnatural angles, their roots exposed, writhing slowly like arthritic fingers. The ground in the center of the clearing had collapsed inward, forming a shallow pit about 10 feet across. And at the bottom of the pit, something was breathing. Johnny climbed off the mule and walked to the edge. His legs were shaking. His vision was blurred. But he could see it clearly. The soil at the bottom of the pit was moving. Expanding and contracting in rhythm. And beneath the soil, barely visible, was something pale. Something ridged. Something that looked like bone but moved like muscle. It was a root. But not from a tree. It was coming from below. Johnny knelt at the edge of the pit and placed his hand on the ground. He could feel it. The vibration. The hum. The immense, ancient presence spreading out beneath him like a network of veins. He spoke to it. Not in English. In the language Falling Hawk had taught him. He said, "I kept my promise. I planted the trees. I gave you silence. I gave you time. But I'm dying. And I can't hold you anymore." The root pulsed. And then, for the first time in 40 years, the root father answered. Not with words. With images. With sensations. With memories that weren't Johnny's own. He saw the frontier before the settlers arrived. Endless forest. Rivers running clear. The land breathing in harmony with itself. He saw the tribes who lived there. The rituals they performed. The offerings they made to keep the balance. He saw the root father beneath it all. Not a monster. Not a demon. A caretaker. A decomposer. The thing that turned death back into soil, rot back into life. But the settlers had broken the balance. They'd cut the forests. Poisoned the rivers. Buried their dead in wooden boxes so the bodies couldn't return to the earth. And the root father had started to starve. Johnny saw what would happen if the seal broke completely. The root systems collapsing. The ground opening. The entity rising to reclaim what had been taken. Not out of malice. Out of necessity. The images stopped. Johnny opened his eyes. Tears were streaming down his face. He understood now. He'd spent his whole life thinking he was protecting the settlers. But he'd been protecting the land. From the settlers. He stood up. His chest was tight. His breath was shallow. He didn't have much time left. He looked at the dying orchard. At the collapsing pit. At the pale root curling upward from the darkness below. And he made a choice. He walked to the center of the clearing, to the edge of the pit, and he lay down. He pressed his body against the soil. He dug his fingers into the dirt. And he spoke one final prayer. Not to God. To the root father. He said, "Take me. I'm old. I'm dying. My body is rot and bone and decay. Let me be the offering. Let me be the bridge. Let my roots hold you. Just a little longer." The ground beneath him shifted. The pale root coiled upward, wrapping around his wrist, his ankle, his throat. Johnny didn't fight it. He closed his eyes. And he let himself sink. The soil swallowed him slowly. Inch by inch. The root pulling him down, threading through his skin, his veins, his bones, integrating him into the network below. Johnny Appleseed became part of the orchard. His last thought was not fear. It was relief. 3 days later, a traveling merchant named Samuel Polk arrived in Archer's Point and asked if anyone had seen the old man who planted apple trees. The locals said no. No one had seen him in weeks. Polk rode out to the orchard to check. He found the mule tied to a tree, but no sign of Johnny. The clearing was quiet. The trees had stopped humming. The roots had settled back into the soil. The pit had closed. But in the center of the clearing, where Johnny had lain down, a single apple tree had sprouted. Overnight. Fully grown. Polk inspected the tree carefully. The bark was rough and gray, scarred with old symbols. The roots were deep, so deep he couldn't see the bottom when he dug around the base. And carved into the trunk, at eye level, was a message. It read, "Guess a man can only outrun history for so long." Polk didn't understand. He reported what he'd found to the church in Fort Wayne, and the church recorded it in their ledger as the probable death of John Chapman, aged 70, 'cause unknown. No body was ever recovered. But the orchard survived. In 1993, a graduate student named Emily Cordova was researching 19th-century land surveys in Indiana when she noticed something strange. Every orchard Johnny Appleseed had planted between 1801 and 1845 was still alive. Not thriving. But alive. Old, gnarled, barely producing fruit. But alive. And when she mapped them, she saw the pattern. A geometric grid stretching from Pennsylvania to Illinois. Circles within circles. Spirals intersecting lines. It looked like a seal. Cordova interviewed locals in the towns near the orchards. Most of them had stories. Strange stories. About trees that hummed at night. About people who disappeared near the clearings. About figures seen moving between the branches. One woman in Mansfield, Ohio, told Cordova her grandmother used to say that Johnny Appleseed wasn't planting apples. He was planting gravestones. Cordova didn't believe her. But she visited the orchard at Archer's Point anyway. The one where Johnny was last seen. The tree in the center of the clearing was still standing. Taller than the others. Older. Its roots spread out in every direction, threading through the soil like veins. Cordova knelt at the base of the tree and pressed her ear to the bark. And she heard it. A heartbeat. Slow. Steady. Alive. She stepped back, her hands shaking, and looked at the tree again. For just a moment, in the ridges of the bark, she thought she saw a face. Old. Weathered. Smiling faintly. She didn't report it. She finished her thesis and moved on. But she never forgot. Because Johnny Appleseed is still out there. Not walking the frontier. Not planting seeds. But holding the ground. Root by root. Year by year. Keeping something ancient asleep. And as long as the orchards stand, as long as the trees breathe, as long as the roots run deep and silent through the American soil, the seal will hold. But one day, the trees will fall. And when they do, the ground will remember. What we buried. What we owe. And what's been waiting, patient and hungry, just beneath our feet. The sound of wind through branches. A distant hum. Silence. End recording.